The dual citizens. This video is kind of several different weeks in the making. I've been thinking about this for quite a bit because I don't know. I have a lot of time to think, which that could be a bad thing. It could be a good thing. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that too much. That's funny. Uh, Thinking about adding a comedic element to this channel just for fun. So the dual citizens is kind of talking about, well, obviously, since this channel is centered around the relation between the sexes and the balancing energies of yin and yang and blah blah blah, it's kind of become more and more focus on the nuances of the power dynamics between the sexes that no one speaks about, the innermost things that people kind of just take for granted, right? So the modern day Western world is focused on leveling out the power dynamics between men and women. But the reasons for that I can't really go into too much. I can graze it. I can't go into it too much because I don't know who monitors this stuff. So anyways, um yeah. So I'm gonna be very quick with this. So essentially, what I've come to realize is let me go top to bottom, not bottom to top. Or yeah, I think that's right. So in a situation where you have a dual citizen, you have a person who has they have citizenship in two different countries at the same time. So, for example, if you have someone who was born in the United States, but then they also have citizenship. Um, they also have a situation where they are citizens of a different country. So, for example, they're citizens of, um, let's say, the Congo, right? So they're dual citizens. They're citizens of the United States and of the Congo. And that means that they get the benefits of being an American and the benefits of being from the Congo. So, um, the reason why I bring this up is because the average woman in the modern Western sphere, but also in the Western world, in America, but also in other countries as well, because women in other countries essentially have the same general inherent biological power as women in the United States. It's kind of all the same. Doesn't matter where you go in the globe. Women are women and men are men, right? Um, my mentor, I guess, he would say he had a there was a guy, he had a saying. He said, "Everywhere he goes, men are men, and so are the women." Which I guess he was saying that the women were trying to be men, but the men were being men as well. um, so, anyways, this is a simple video and it's an introduction, so I don't really feel compelled to speak too much. Trying to make these videos a bit shorter in length. So, kind of like what I was saying at the beginning, women are dual citizens of sorts, right? They exist in two different worlds at the same time, and they get benefits from both of these worlds. Now, the world they currently exist in was a product of the 1960s, uh, the movements in the 1960s, which were kind of fighting for them to essentially get into the workforce so that uh, the financiers of those times could actually benefit on an expanded working pool, et cetera, blah blah blah. Right? It goes off into infinity, you know. But the main point of it is that they have the benefit of what the average guy would have benefited from 60, 70 years ago. But then you add that and you bolster it with the power they inherently have and the value they inherently have just from fertility and beauty, then essentially their power is twofold. It becomes something that is kind of like a runaway train. Suddenly, the men around them who wield the exact same power become superfluous, and suddenly, the society itself ends up spiraling out of control. The fertility rates drop because the men end up becoming kind of useless to them on a innate underlying level. The men would be useful if they had 3 to 4 to 5 times the wealth of the average woman. But I've noticed, here's another thing I've noticed. Um, it seems like we're trying to liberate people from something that they need, right? And we're doing that thinking that that's what's going to make their life better. But I've noticed we're not doing we're doing that with women. We're saying, "Oh, well, you don't need a man anymore. Therefore, now you can want a man." And the fact that you can want a man makes your life better. What if we did that same thing? And of course, no one's going to like this, but what if we did that same thing to children, right? Because that's kind of where this is all headed. With a child, we say, okay, a child needs a parent, but the fact that a child needs its parents is it's it's oppressive, right? Because if you have an autonomous human being, a person who can think by themselves alone and do things alone, maybe the child can't protect himself, him or herself, but the child needs a parent. Therefore, the child is being oppressed by its parents. Therefore, the child has to be liberated from the parents because the parents are subjugating the child and telling the child what the child should and shouldn't do, controlling what the child spends and stuff like that. Does it sound familiar? We were using similar arguments with women in the 1950s and 60s about use uh, how they couldn't get credit cards unless they went through their husbands and stuff like that. Not recognizing that the husbands were responsible for um, the finances of the family, and so that if the woman got a card, then he would actually be held responsible for her financial decisions. So, regardless of that, when you kind of take that example, it means that we should actually liberate our children as well, because they were also just like women were a protected class. But um, if we keep going down that end, obviously we know where it's going to go. Um, but um, yeah, anyways, let me stay focused. So the dual citizen, where it becomes an issue is that, um, as I said, the men become superfluous. Where there is no role for them, then essentially they're just kind of flypaper on the wall, don't really matter. But then the women matter twice as much, right? Because they already matter. So there's already an inherent value assigned to them at birth just for the fact that they're women. But then the value of the men is essentially halves, which essentially means that you get a population of men that become more and more desperate and end up becoming more and more dangerous because of that desperateness, that desperation. Um, and the desperation is to propagate their genes into the future, right? To find a mate, and in order for males to do that, they have to prove their value outside of actually existing, right? Because existing on the planet as a man isn't good enough for men to have value. And that's part of the reason why when men lose their jobs, when they lose something that actually gives them some sort of substance to other people, like something instrumental, right? um, they end up self-deleting or just or worse, like depression. I don't know what's worse than self-deletion, but they go into a depression. Apparently, men when they retire, it's not uncommon for them to die off in the next 2 or 3 years after retirement. Um, I think this is something that is specific to men, that the use and issue that men have is something that is not being realized, that what we gain, what we lose when women um, essentially take on the role of the male is essentially that we lose the male value, ends up becoming superfluous, which when that happens, society is kind of doomed to, it's going to destabilize to the point. Now this is what's going to happen, right? It's going to destabilize. It's going to get so bad that essentially you're going to have mass violence. You're going to have situations where um, no one's really going to have, so the desire to protect, um, of course I think we'll still have the desire to protect children, but we won't have that for women. And that kind of goes into another video. um, in order to want to protect something, there has to be a degree of naivety involved in the thing that you're protecting, right? You can't, or at least there's an aspect of naivety that we want to believe that the thing that we're protecting is incapable of protecting itself. But if you prop up women into being this thing that is super powerful and that can protect herself and is super strong, then the creatures who are actually biologically wired to protect them will not want to protect them because they will see them as their equals, or at least on some level. So that means you could have situations where a woman was taken advantage of on the train and the males essentially did nothing and they just sat back while all this stuff happened because they didn't want to intervene. So these kind of things are going to happen more and more, and society is going to stop looking like a place that is actually hospitable. Now, the people with enough IQ points to see these things before they happen, obviously, they're not going to sound the alarm because they'll just get ignored or they'll be ridiculed into silence. But that was kind of a dark end I went down. But such is the nature of this channel. I don't really shy away from darkness. I welcome it even, um, to a point where it's constructive, but not to where it consumes. So the dual citizens essentially was a, it was a bolstering of value, beyond what was already there. And this is kind of something we see, that now that women have more and more and more value, they're kind of, obviously we can kind of see that there's no end in sight. There's no, oh, now I'm happy now that I have this. No, it's this ravenous, uh, like this need to constantly get more and more and more and more and more. We're realizing just how greedy women are and just how greedy humans are. And we're also recognizing that, generally speaking, humans just have to be balanced out. There has to be a limiter on, uh, on what we can do. There has to be some sort of check and balance and power, because if there's not, then we just kind of run wild and we run over people without even recognizing it. And even if we recognize it, our egos just kind of take us to wherever we want to go. So now that women work, that they're in the workforce and they can take advantage of the fact that they're women and that they have inherent value just for existing. This is something that is kind of like a, like it's good for them because it gives them more options, but it's a double-edged sword because, um, well, a couple of things. They end up losing the initial value. Um, the initial value, at least over time, the thing that they're valued for first, which is youth and fertility, they put that on the back burner, but then that value slowly depreciates over time, right? At least with the men, yes, we're only valued for what we can do, but we can do that all the way up till we're 50, 60, 70 years old, at least until we keel over. I've always thought it was annoying to just kind of be invisible or not seen and things like that. And I guess I'm kind of weird because even though people say that I'm like attractive or like handsome or something like that, in my experience, I've actually been mostly invisible for most of my life, which is fascinating to me. But I also think it's kind of um, just the nature of things. Um, it's a weird position to be in because I always feel like I have to accomplish something very I always feel like I have to accomplish something very difficult or something that increases my social status to where it's super high or something like that. And it makes me think of that guy who said, um, there's a quote where, see if I can type it up. I think it was, I believe it was Henry David Thoreau. He was saying that men live lives of quiet desperation. Um, I believe what he was speaking about was the fact that males don't inherently have value just for existing. So most of the time, whenever we're just out and about, we're always conscious of the fact that we're kind of superfluous until we create something that gives us the same uh, social status as the average woman would have, or even more, right? Because if I become like a millionaire, billionaire, then I would be seen as better, perhaps, than the average woman. But um, yeah, but even a guy who is like a millionaire, he would basically be on the same social plane as the average woman because he would be able to accrue the same amount of uh, um, social influence. Whereas the average guy would basically be invisible, alone. No one would care about him until he can prove either through having other women around him. Because if you have other women around you, then you're valuable. Um, that's another thing. But the weird thing about dual citizens is that, um, as a concept, is that the same thing doesn't exist for men, but then also it ends up being that the more equality you try to give the average woman, the more you actually make her a man's superior. Ironically, you had philosophers saying these very things in the past, um, saying that if you give women more rights and you give them more money, more blah blah blah, then they end up becoming your superiors. Um, it's funny. I'm looking back at what they're saying and thinking about why they were saying it, and I can actually see it very clearly. Those philosophers were taking into account that those women already had value for being women, for being attractive, for being for fertility, for beauty. That is something they already had. So by attempting to make them on par with you and give them the opportunities that you have as a man, you're essentially making them superior to you because you're bolstering the value they already have. Just something to think about. The dual citizens.